episode of Thursdays at 3. I'm Jacqueline Goldstein, curator at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. And I'm so happy to have you guys here joining us today. Joining us for this episode is Fristoe Stewart. She is the director of the Leiber Collection based in East Hampton, New York. And we're going to be talking with her. She knew the Leibers for many, many years, and we are getting an inside look into Judith and her husband Gerson and the lives that they led and the work that they did. And it's we're very excited. And I wanted to thank Dan and Maura Weiss for sponsoring these programs Thursdays at 3. And here we go. I want to introduce you to Anne. Anne, say hello.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so thrilled to be here to share the stories of Judith and Gerson Leiber with you all. Thank you, Jacqueline, for inviting me.
So I think the best way to get to start is I'll pull up some images, and then we will have you speak with them. Let's see here. Okay, so now, Anne, I guess let's get started with a little bit of background on Judith. And I guess, you know what, I want to start with the Leiber Collection. How was that started, and how did you become a part of it?
Okay, so the Leiber Collection is a tiny little jewel of a museum. It's in East Hampton, New York. It was founded by Judith and Gerson Leiber, and it really was their way to house their collection, house Judith Leiber's designs and Gerson Leiber's artwork. Gus really wanted to keep Judith Leiber's handbags in the forefront of people's minds. I think a lot of designers, when they retire, their designs sort of just fade away, and he didn't want that to happen with his wife's work. So they decided to make a museum, and they designed the building. It's a Renaissance structure, a Palladian structure. It's a beautiful little museum. And Gus Leiber was inspired by the temples that dot the landscapes of the great gardens of Europe. And so he used that. He dreamed the space inspired by these temples. And we call it the Leiber Taj Mahal because he really designed it out of his great love and devotion for his wife. And it's a great sort of vessel of their devotion to one another.
That's exciting. So how did you meet them?
So I met them. So they opened the museum in 2005, and they started with a archivist who's a friend of mine, and she got offered a position at a contemporary art gallery in East Hampton, but she didn't want to leave the Leibers, without someone that they really would trust. So she called me and said, I want you to come meet the Leibers. She said, don't take it personally if they don't like you. She said, they don't like everyone. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not sure I want to come over there. But I came, and I fell madly in love with both of them. They were so wonderful, so cultured and interesting, so bright. I always say they have these big brains. They were just a joy to meet and to talk to. We ended up chatting for about 4 hours. And they offered me the position to manage their museum. And then they brought me on as the director and the curator. So in the early days, the three of us would curate exhibitions together. And after about a year of that, they decided to, let me do it by myself. And, it was just so wonderful to work with them and to live beside them. It was wonderful.
Excellent. Well, I have this particular bag up on screen. Tell us about it.
So this handbag is called the Chatelaine, and it is the very first metal bag that Judith Leiber designed. And when she designed this piece, she wanted to create a handbag that the ladies didn't have to go to the bank, to the safe deposit box to take out at night and then put back in. And so she designed this bag to be made in sheet metal. It's brass, and then it's gold or silver plated. And she designed it in 1967. Originally, she did not even think of the crystals. She really wanted it to be a metal bag. And so in her factory, her sculptor sculpted the wax, and they sent it off to Italy where her fabricators were. And in Italy, they made the big metal die. They heated the sheet metal, pressed it in the die. Then they popped it out. They dipped the metal pieces into the plating bath. And plating is an electrical current process. And in 67, the electrical current in Italy left a bit to be to the imagination. So when they got these bags back to her factory in Manhattan, they were tarnished all at the bottom and pockmarked. But she knew she didn't want to send them back. She would lose money. So she thought, what can I do to disguise this problem but enhance the beauty? And so she thought of Swarovski crystals. She ran down to the accessories district, which is where her factory was, grabbed the Swarovski crystals and some jeweler's adhesive and made this gorgeous design. And this was the start of the entire beaded bag industry that she excelled in.
Wow.
So this is a photograph of her, Judith Leiber, on the right, with her older sister Eva and her mother. And I knew Eva as well, and they had such a beautiful relationship. And she really did look at, with this admiration at her, even when they were 93 years old and 97. So she was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1921. She grew up in a very sophisticated, very cultured, upper middle class Jewish family. And they were highly educated. They traveled. They loved art. They loved opera. And she was just, an incredible student. She actually, when she was 17, so the equivalent to our basically 11th grade, her parents sent her to London to King's College to study chemistry. She was a math whiz, a science whiz, and they wanted her to ultimately take over her great aunt's cosmetics company that was in Romania. And she used to laugh and say, "Oh, I could have been Estee Lauder, but instead I'm Judith Leiber." Either one would have been amazing. But she did go to London. She did study chemistry, and in the first summer, she came home, the summer of 38 or 39, sorry. She went to London in 38. 39, she came home, and in September, as we all know, the war broke out. So World War II started, and she was really forced to stay in Hungary, in Budapest. She didn't want to leave her family. She adored them, as you can tell, and did not want to leave them. So she didn't want to just sit around and do nothing. So she tried to come up with something that she could do. And there were horrible laws against Jews in Budapest at that time, and they weren't allowed to go to university. They weren't allowed to work in many fields, but they were allowed to enter a trade. And so her mother, her whole life, had the most beautiful collection of fine handbags that her father had brought home from his travels in the West to her mother. And she adored these bags. She never carried them, she said, but she looked at them on the shelves with just, incredible longing. And so when she had to choose a trade, she decided to enter the Hungarian Handbag Makers Guild. So she was actually the first female apprentice in the Handbag Makers Guild. And she was able to work her way up from an apprentice to a journeyman and ultimately a master, all before the war started raging in Hungary. The war came late to Hungary, so she was able to have a few years of, relative security before it really took a turn for the worse. What's our next slide? Oh, okay. So wait, I have to, that's later. Sorry.
Tricking you.
What's that?
I said I'm tricking you, keeping you on your toes.
So, in Hungary, they were able to, really go about life. It was severely limited, but it wasn't as violent and hostile in the beginning. She was able to learn the handbag trade. She was able to design handbags. But there came a time when it just fell apart, and her father was actually taken off the streets of Budapest, Hungary, and he was put in a labor camp. And in that labor camp, he was digging trenches against the Russian tanks. And he was really almost worked to death and almost starved to death. And the Petos had a friend who worked for the Swiss consulate. And through this friend, Judith Leiber was able to get a Swiss pass for her father. And the Swiss pass said Emil Peto, and it gave him diplomatic immunity. So her mother was able to send the Swiss pass down to the commandant of the labor camp, and he was able to get out of the labor camp. And so Judith, her sister Eva, her mother, and her father were reunited in a Swiss protected house in Budapest. And in this house, there was a young boy, 16 years old, who saw the Swiss pass and recognized the typeface, and he located a typewriter with that typeface, and he added "and family" to the end of Emil Peto, and really saved the entire Peto family from ultimate death. That Swiss pass is in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., next to the list that had the Peto's name on it, that they were going to be sent to Auschwitz. And she had uncles that were killed in Budapest, and many family members, but she would always say that they survived, and it was just almost a miracle. But in this Swiss protected house, they had 26 people in a 1-bedroom apartment, and they were all on mattresses on the floor. They were only let out of the apartment at certain times, and food was very scarce. But again, she would say, we survived. But then there came a time that whether you were protected or not in Budapest, if you were Jewish, they would march you down to the Jewish ghetto. And that day came for the Petos. And so at gunpoint, the Hungarian Nazis marched them down to the ghetto. And that portion of her life was just almost unbearable. And they were right on the banks of the Danube, and the Germans were on one side, the Russians were on the other, and bombs were going right overhead. And she said that the only thing that kept her sane was that she would design handbags in her head, and that would help her to sleep at night. And she has a famous quote that says that Hitler made her a handbag designer. And she talked about the fact that, you know, she had this incredible resolve that um, she was not going to fail, that she and her family were going to survive. And they did. She actually was struck by a bomb, a shrapnel of a bomb in her arm, and she went to there was a doctor in the ghetto, and he looked at her and said, "You'll never use your hands again." And you can imagine with what she had, you know, spent the last years on, and you know, really what she felt was her life's calling of designing and building handbags. Uh, it would have been devastating to not be able to use your hands. So her father heard of a Jewish surgeon on the other side of town in a cellar, um, and they made their way over there secretively, and he was able to take the shrapnel out of her arm, and as you can tell, she was able to create these amazing handbags still. Um, so the Russians did ultimately liberate the Jews. The Peto family was able to head home. They went back to their apartment building, and the windows were blown out, and there was no electricity or heat, but it was pretty much intact other than that. So all of the people that lived in the apartment building stayed in the basement. It was something like 60 people in the basement until the repairs were made. But then they were able to go back into their home. And one of the very first days of their liberation, the Americans came to town, and the American legation came. It was a group of the Allied forces, so it wasn't just Americans, but they came to Budapest to keep the peace and help the transitional government. And one of the Americans was Gus Leiber, Gerson Leiber. He called himself Gus. And Judith and one of her friends, one of her dear friends, actually had a room in in her family's apartment that they wanted to rent to an American. They felt that you know, the American dollar was just like gold in Budapest at that point. And so the friend did not speak English, and Judith, of course, spoke perfect English. She spoke 5 languages fluently and many dialects. And so she says that she went solely as a translator. And so her friend and she walked up to this group of American GIs that were standing outside of the pension where they were staying. And Judith and Gerson both said it was love at first sight. She said she knew immediately she wanted to marry him. And he said that she was so cultured and so bright and loved music that he was smitten. And he invited her to the opera, which was one of her favorite things to do. And the rest is history. They courted for about a year, and then they were married in her family's apartment in Budapest. You know, he was an American. He was an artist. Her parents were kind of like, "You're doing what? You're marrying? No, you're not marrying this American artist." And she said, yes, she was, and that she held so firm. And, you know, obviously he was so charming, and the family fell madly in love with him as well. And so they allowed her to marry him. And so they lived in Budapest for about a year, and she made handbags for the ladies of the American legation, and sold everything she made. The Americans loved her designs, loved her handbags. And Gus was still in the military, but they had a scenario where they were 3 days on and 3 days off. And the military wanted the GIs to do something enriching when they had their days off. So Judith took Gerson to the Royal Academy of Budapest, and he entered art school, and he studied printmaking and drawing and painting. And he set up a studio with another Hungarian young artist, and just he was so in love with art at that point. He was very skilled in art when he was young in high school, but his parents thought that is not that's not a profession. And so he, when he was out of high school, he started working at the Titusville Herald, which was his local newspaper in Titusville, Pennsylvania. But as he traveled through Northern Africa and Europe, the Mediterranean, and then Budapest, his eyes were open to the incredible beauty of art and in the museums and the galleries around the world. And he knew that that's what he wanted. He wanted to be an artist. So he began studying in Budapest, but after about a year, he was given the option to either re-enlist or to go back to America, and they decided that they would go to America. And so they bid her family farewell and got on a bride ship, which I didn't know there was such a thing, but the American military had these ships where the American GIs and their brides would come back to America. And the Leibers said that the wives were on one side and the husbands were on the other, and they weren't allowed to be together. And she said she was seasick the whole time, and that she would never go on a boat again. And I think that's true. I didn't ever see her on another boat. But they got to America, and they really thought of New York as their promised land. Judith really, she said that the experiences of the Holocaust were seared in their brains, and it was a place they were very happy to be away from the land where that occurred. And Gus went into the Art Students League for art school, and she began making handbags for other handbag manufacturers. So she started at a very inexpensive handbag company called Garay, but she quickly worked her way up to working for the top handbag designer in America at the time, who was Nettie Rosenstein. And Nettie designed, fine couture gowns and dresses. And she had Judith Leiber come as her sole handbag designer. And she designed for Nettie Rosenstein for about almost 20 years. But in 1953, Nettie Rosenstein was asked to make Mamie Eisenhower's gown for her husband's inaugural ball. And Nettie Rosenstein asked Judith Leiber to make the handbag. And it was this beautiful pink, beaded bag, and it really captured the imagination of ladies all across America. And so Judith Leiber really became a household name in the 50s. She started her business in 1963, so about 10 years later. And the fact that she was already a well-known designer really helped her. And not to mention the fact that she was so talented. But this is a picture of her in her studio, and you see behind some of these prints of Gus Leibers on the wall and her tools of the trade. So she never made drawings of her designs. They were in her head, and she would go straight with the knife to cut the patterns. And then she would cut the fabrics. And so there's this cutting board. We actually have one in the museum, the Leiber Collection museum, but that was where she would do all of her work. And she would always stand at this cutting board and make designs. Gus Leiber would say, Judy can see a handbag in everything. And she really, I mean, when you see some of her bags, you really realize she could. She was inspired everywhere she went. He said she designed handbags. He said she designed handbags 24 hours a day in her sleep, and then in her studio, and also at the factory. So in 1963, she started her company with Gus by her side, and they were pretty much an immediate success. They started in a tiny little studio on Madison Avenue at 33rd Street with 4 employees, and she and Gus. And within a year and a half, they had to go to a larger factory, and it kept going just like that as they continued on. She started out with skins, with leathers. The very first line that they created, she said, was a huge flop, and but she always said she learned a great lesson from this flop. And she described the first line as very European, that everything was made out of the same skin and the same color. It was a very fine calf skin, and it was a color that in 1963 was very popular. It was a sort of grayish green or greenish gray. I think it was more green than gray. But she said it just didn't sell. But in her defense, 1963, these bags hit the shelves right after JFK was assassinated. So people weren't buying handbags. They were really, their minds were in a completely different place. But she says that the lesson she learned was from that moment on, she never put all of her creative eggs in one basket. And she, and you'll see when you see some of these, she would use all different kinds of materials, skins, lots of different colors, lots of different skins, fabrics, and then ultimately the metals. She created the metal bags and the skins and the fabric bags all throughout her career from 67 on. And just the breadth and depth of her creative genius and it's mind-boggling when you see them all. When you all come to the Leiber collection and see where we have about 600 of her bags displayed at one time, it's just amazing. And this is really one of my very favorites. This is inspired by Faith Ringgold. And this was made in 1985. It's called the Street Story Quilt. And Judith Leiber had a great friendship with Faith Ringgold. And Faith Ringgold, as I don't know if you know, I imagine you know, she was an African-American artist that used a female craft form of quilts in her work. And she made these extraordinary quilts that had these scenes from her life. And this one is, an apartment building in Harlem. There was one called Tar Beach that is one of my favorites. And the Leibers actually bought Tar Beach from Faith Ringgold, the quilt. It's enormous. It's a huge quilt. And it showed the story of these children and in Harlem, and they would go up to the rooftops of their apartment buildings, and that was their beach. That was where they could hang out with their friends or lay out on towels on the beach, and they would imagine what was happening in the sky, where the planes were going and what what the clouds looked like. It was such a beautiful quilt. And the Leibers actually donated that quilt, that piece of art, to the Guggenheim Museum, which made Faith Ringgold one of the first females, and I believe the first African American to be in that collection, the Guggenheim collection. But this one I just love as well. And Judith Leiber was inspired by artists frequently, And this one is just, it's very unique. It was one of the first that she actually made a minodier, a metal bag with the beads, inspired by an artist. The next one I also love. This is Faith Ringgold as well. It's called the Purple Quilt, and it was designed after a quilt that Faith Ringgold made, that was inspired by the color purple, the story, The Color Purple. And it's just such a gorgeous sort of celebration of quilting. You can see the sort of shapes and forms of what would be very typical in a quilt behind, and then these fantastic African-American women. So they did have a great friendship and this great inspiration back and forth between the two. This piece was actually in the exhibition at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, and it is a beautiful little pink pig minodier. And I spoke a little bit about how the sculptor would make these waxes, and this is a good one to look at where, you know, Judith Leiber would say, oh, I want the eye to sort of be winking, or, you know, make the smile a little more, you know, upturned, or, you know, just these tiny little sort of detailed changes that would affect the piece, you know, very strongly. So this was made in 1982. I was telling Jacqueline earlier that this one has been on the red carpet for the Oscars. It was carried by Christine Cavanaugh, who was actually the voice of Babe in the movie, the animated film Babe. And so this little pig has been on the Oscar red carpet. It's very sweet. And this is a shell minodier. It's inspired from a natural seashell, but you see these two different areas that open. You see a little top sort of compartment. When you open that, it has a mirror inside. And if you press the little button there, it opens up, and that's the handbag. So, you know, it's really gorgeous. It has semi-precious stones, some cornelian, some garnet, some lapis, and then these crystal Swarovski crystals. Just, can you imagine carrying that to a party? It's just so beautiful.
And it's amazing that she created that pop-up mirror, or compact, if you will, so you can pop it up, look at your face, close it, and then open your bag. Wow.
I know.
Wow.
It's a genius.
Did she do that with any of the other bags?
So there are bags that have different compartments. This is the only one that has its own mirror. Mm-hmm. But in all of the handbags that she designed, she included a little mirror, a comb, and a little change purse. But this one, she really wanted it to sort of open like a clamshell would open, and then have a surprise where you're actually looking at your own beautiful face. And that was the only one that she did like that. But there are others that have secret compartments. There's a bag that she designed that's called the 007 bag. And it does actually have this little secret pocket at the bottom. So it's this very sort of classical handbag shape, maybe similar to a Kelly bag. And you would open the top and you would, you know, see everything that's in there. But then there was this other compartment at the bottom that if you opened it from the bottom, you'd have this other compartment. One day I was at the museum, and this beautiful woman came in. She was dressed just stunningly, and she was from Texas, so she had a great accent. And I was giving her a little tour, and I showed her that she was drawn to this 007 bag. And so I was telling her a little bit about the bag and telling her about this secret compartment. And she was like, oh, that's a perfect place for me to keep my gun. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to cross you. I was like wondering where she had it right now. I'm like, oh no. But she loved that bag because she could hide her gun in the secret pocket.
Wow, it's too much information from her, right?
Yes, yes.
Several of the bags that I borrowed had reading glasses, like little folded up reading glasses. Was that special order or did they come in? Was that just an option?
I don't think those were Judith Leibers. Those must have been from the collectors, but they all had,
Really?
yeah, they all had the comb,
Hmm.
the mirror, and the change purse.
That's nice.
So the change purses and the metal bags they'd be from the same material from the lining. So this lining would be a gold calf. Some would have a silver calf skin, and the little bag change purse would be made out of the same material. If they're a fabric bag, they're usually made out of the same fabric as the handbag was made out of.
Okay.
Yeah.
This
And
one.
this is a gift, a wrapped gift, a wrapped box. That one is from 1993, and it's just this gorgeous sort of celebration. I mean, you can imagine someone gifting that to you on your birthday, or another great celebration. But she would create this in the same way. This one's actually a good one to be able to sort of see the sort of hand marks or the brush strokes on the wax, and you can see this sort of Florentine sort of striation on the gold, and then this fantastic little bow made out of the crystals, and then the tassel, which she included on a lot of her bags. And then also all of them have a shoulder strap except the cat and the horse, which Judy really wanted the cat and the horse to be held in the hand, but they all fit so beautifully in the hand. I'm sure you realized when you were installing your
Oh
show
yeah.
and got to hold
Oh
them.
yeah. Oh yeah.
It fits so beautifully. And then, you push the little button and open them up. And if you wanted to wear it over your shoulder, there is a shoulder strap, and it is hidden inside by these great hinges that basically hide it. You really can't tell that it's hidden. And then it opens up, the strap comes out, and you can still close it because of this hinging mechanism that is hidden within the seam. So yeah, this is a beautiful, beautiful bag.
Did she create the hinging mechanism?
So apparently, she, someone was talking earlier about they met someone that helped with some of the designs of, the clasps and the locks, and but this was supposedly a design element that she came up with. That first metal bag that you saw
Right.
did not have that hinging design in 1967, and the shoulder strap was actually attached to these rings that were soldered right onto the outside of the bag.
Okay.
Also, because she had used this jeweler's adhesive, she just did not like that design, because the shoulder strap was always out. And then because the adhesive wasn't as good as what she ultimately designed, the shoulder strap could hit the crystals and knock them off. So the next line she made, so 1968, she designed this hinging system, and then she also formulated a adhesive that was so much stronger, and that was the adhesive that they still use in the company today. She did have this incredible, chemistry background, and her design sense was amazing. And, she did design how those mechanisms work. Maybe somebody, your friend might have, or the person that I guess came to one of your shows said that they had worked with her, and, so they might have been the hands for the idea, kind of thing.
Right.
And this is a Gus Leiber painting. This painting was made in 1981, and it's called The Model in the White Gown. And it's just such a beautiful painterly rendering of, sort of the life that Gus found himself in. He always said that his wife's world, he felt, was a fertile ground for his artwork. And so when Judith would go to the runway shows, he would go with her, and he would be sketching and drawing, and for about 30 years used the fashion world as his muse. So lots of models, runways. He also had the Party People series, which were the people that surrounded the models. And when he painted the models, they were always this beautiful painterly paint strokes. And when he painted the Party People, he used more of a garish kind of paint stroke. And it was very interesting. It was sort of a tongue-in-cheek critique about this world that he, would always say he found himself in. And he loved being in that world and using it as inspiration for his artwork. But in the showrooms, when people would come in to, the buyers would come in to buy Judith Leiber bags for the department stores or boutiques, and designers would come in, and on the walls would be these amazing Gus Leiber paintings. So most of Gus's paintings are in collections of the fashion world, because they would come in, they would order the bags for Saks Fifth Avenue or Neiman Marcus, and then they would buy for themselves the Gus Leiber paintings or prints. And this one is just one of my favorites.
Speaking of,
so this is a Judith Leiber Minaudier that was inspired by a Gus Leiber painting. So the painting is one of the Party People paintings, and it's called The Much Adored. And Gus made the painting in 1994, and Judith used that as an inspiration for this Minaudier. And this one is really special. There's sort of these things that aren't on any other bag, any of her other creations. And you see sort of at the bottom right, these look like hatch marks, but those are actually Roman numerals. And she never numbered her bags, but with the Gus Leiber inspired Minaudier, he always signed the bottom. He always signed it Leiber. I mean, he always signed his paintings at the bottom. And so she used where Leiber would be, because she never put her name on the outside of a bag. She would number them. And so this one, it looks like, I don't know, 35 or something like that. And when I had not seen this bag for many, many years. It was one of the bags that Judith Leiber really wanted, and we never could find it for sale. She didn't have it in her collection, but we had the painting. And so people would always say to me, or first they would say to her when she was living, they would say, Judy, if you could have any bag you don't have, what would it be? And so she would say, I really want the Gus Leiber inspired Minaudier. And so after their death, I was giving a talk at a museum, and I got to that point in my slideshow and was talking about that, and a woman stood up from the audience and said, what bag does Judy want? And I said, the Gus Leiber inspired Minaudier. She said, I've got it. It's yours. And the next Sunday, I know. The next Sunday, she came into the museum with her Gus Leiber inspired Minaudier and gifted it to us. And we were just beyond. So now the painting and the handbag are shown side by side. But but it was interesting because we didn't know, what these Roman numerals were all about and how many of these were even in existence. And so there was a New York Times article that talked about this. And that summer, I had 8 different ladies either call me or walk into the museum with their Gus Leiber and wanted to show me.
Wow.
And so the one that had the highest Roman numeral was about 48, I believe. So we know there's at least 48. There might be more. But the woman that gave this bag to us is Joanna Rose from New York City. She's an incredible, philanthropist and just an amazing woman. And hers has Judith written on the back in crystals, and none of the other ones did. So it's so interesting that there were these little, special things that happen in some of these, because they're all handmade, they're not one of a kind, but because of the method of manufacturing these, and they're all made by hand, each one is a little slightly bit different. And here's the Peacock. This is such a gorgeous sort of last hurrah. This was the last handbag that Judith.
If I may interject, thank you for lending us to us for this show.
Yes, our pleasure. It's was living in Florida for how long was the show? Six months?
Yeah, from start till we shut the museum, and then we had them there.
Yeah.
6 months, yeah.
So, I mean, absolutely stunningly gorgeous. It's got these multicolor crystals. It has, little beads, the pearl beads. It has the lapis stones. I mean, it's just one of those things that you can't help but just be inspired by. And, we have it right in the entryway of our museum. And, people open the door, and I mean, 99% of the people that enter, they just go, wow. It's like, that's the statement when anyone walks in. I wish I had a hidden camera to get all the wows, but it's absolutely stunning. And she went out with a bang. She, she tried to retire numerous times, and to retire from designing, but she remained the sole designer until this bag, which was 2004. Now the company is still a company. They still are making Judith Leiber handbags. They make them in her tradition. And the main designer, Jana Matheson, for years and years has come out, visited the museum, and spoken to the Leibers. She always, the first thing she would say is, will you make one more? And Judith would always say, nope, I'm retired. And, but, be inspired. And she would invite her to come and hold all the bags and, really learn whatever she wanted to learn from Judith's designs. And this is a Mondrian inspired handbag. It's an envelope. It's karung, different karung skins. And karung is a water snake. And it has these calf skin delineating lines. But you can see, some of her inspiration of just she would go to the museums around really the world, but in New York City as well, and be inspired by other artists. She loved these envelopes. I'd say one other thing about the envelope, is that she really saw these envelopes as a canvas that she could create on, and she would add, different skins, different colors, these incredible designs. Numerous times she was inspired by another artist, but the technical skills it took to create these envelopes where she would have these different skins, and even with the same skin, you've got different thicknesses. And so she created a method of skiving where she would thin the edges so that you could actually attach these different skins. But if you could imagine sort of a karung, and then alligator, and then leather, that is super technically difficult. So these were some of her very favorite bags, because a lot of designers would shy away from that, and she just jumped right in. She was not gonna shy away from the difficult things, technical, decisions. And then we've got the watermelon, which is so fun. And, this really sort of epitomizes the whimsy and the wit that she had in her design. You know, she had a series of foods, the watermelon, the asparagus, the tomato, and they became really some of her most iconic bags. But this is a beautiful multicolor crystal bag that has the jet bead decorations and lock.
So stunning. I mean, such a refreshing bag. So,
Right?
so stunning.
She loved when people would wear, like the watermelon to a garden party, or she saw one of her friends one time out in the Hamptons riding her bike to the farmers market with her butterfly monodier, and she wrote her a note saying how she loved seeing that she was actually. I
Wow.
know, isn't that sweet?
That's a great story.
And
This one I really adore. This is so cool.
this is the Viva Las Vegas, and she had a lot of fans in Las Vegas, and a lot of um, the boutiques and all of the, hotels and casinos would just sell Judith Leiber handbags like crazy. And so this was sort of her ode to Viva Las Vegas. She did design quite a few bags that were about a city. So, we have the New York skyline as one, the Hollywood bag, which is the Hollywood sign, which was one of her absolute favorites. And then we have like Texas, which is obviously not, so we've got Texas, we have, well, I can't even remember them all, but there was a whole series of these bags that were for, either cities or states. And she really had a connection with Las Vegas, that, it was sort of a mecca for people that wanted, sort of bright, shiny objects. And so many Judith Leiber handbag was sold in casinos.
So, how did she know? By the way, we're open for questions. If anybody wants to put anything now in the chat, we're open for questions. First question I have is, how did she, how was the number determined for each bag that she made?
So she would always create the prototype, the original, the very first bag. And she would introduce sort of 5 lines a year, sometimes 6, but typically 5. And she would introduce those lines in her showroom. And buyers would come to the showroom and they would make orders. So the first one was always designed by her, and then they would go into production. And, she would oversee the production of everyone, but she had people that would work for her creating the bags after that first one. So say the watermelon, which is one of the most successful and popular ones, they may have sold 2,000 at one time. And so then that would go into the production line. And then she had, ultimately she had 200 workers that would be in the factory creating these handbags. But she would walk up and down. She had 3 floors of a factory building, and in the shadows of the Empire State Building is what the Leibers would always say. And she would go down one floor, up the stairs, down the next floor, up the stairs. That's what she did all day long. But because she could speak 5 languages and multiple dialects, she could speak to the workers in their own language, which I do believe is one of the real reasons why the quality could stay so high, is that she really would spend time with each person. She would train them initially. She actually trained me to be able to do the beading of a bag. Yeah, it's incredible. But she would make sure that her level of quality was adhered to by constantly walking through every, watching the production and overseeing the production of every bag.
That's amazing. That is
Yeah.
amazing. So I wanted our viewers to know, what did she use for the beading? How did she put each of the crystals onto the Minaudiers? Because this is fascinating.
So it is very low tech, but very, specific. So when the metal bags would come back from Italy, they would just be shells. In the factory, she would clean up the shells. She would put the bags together. She would line them. She would, put any hardware on, the locks and the chain. And then it would go into the beading part of the factory. And when it arrived there was a white gesso that was applied to the outside of the metal. And she had 5 people that she trusted to take her original design and paint that design onto the metal bags, onto this gesso. And then it was turned over to these 100 approximately beaders. And at the factory, they would have all the colors of the beads in front of them. And then they were basically painting by number or beading by color. And they would take, the little cuticle sticks that are made out of wood.
Right.
And that's what they used. And on the end of the stick, the pointy end, they would put a little dollop of beeswax. And so they had their little, glue bottles, and they would dip the tapered end of this cuticle stick into the glue, the adhesive, and then they would make a line. They'd flip the tool over, and with the beeswax, they would pick up the color of the crystal that they wanted and apply it right into the exact space. And I mean, it was extraordinary, because if you think of these beaded bags, like think of a tomato that's, you've got all of these convex curves, and she designed these before the computer. Now you could figure out how to place these crystals with a computer, and it would just figure out how to put everyone on and exactly where it would be. But she didn't have a computer. They didn't exist then. And she created the designs, and she could see it in her head. I mean, it's really, it is a very complicated math problem to figure out how you make these crystals all line up when you get to the other side, right? And she could just see it in her head, and she could do it. So then, she had to train others to see that. But then, these 5 that could then recreate the design helped those, to be able to keep the designs within, the crystals within the right colors. So pretty extraordinary. Are you frozen or am I? Oh.
Everything.
Jackie, if anybody wants to put anything in the chat, because everyone's muted, we'll take questions from the chat.
Is there anything in the chat? Let's see. What do we have? Put your questions. So does anybody have any questions before we finish up today? If you do, let us know. Raise hands, put them in the chat. Because we're almost out of time. What time is it? It's about 4 o'clock.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely amazing. Okay, let's see. Do we have a question here? Did Judith's mom have a chance to see her work?
Yes. So her parents were able to immigrate to America as well. And after the war, they first went to Australia, but then were able to immigrate. So they lived in New York City, as did her sister Eva and Judith. So they did see her work, and were incredibly proud of her. Absolutely.
That's exciting. The next one is, did they have children? They didn't have children, right?
So they didn't. They really focused all of their energies on their work and their craft, their artwork. They each had an answer to that question, and I love to say them because you can get a glimpse into their psyches. But Gus Leiber would say, our children hang from the shoulders of the ladies and on the walls of the museums and galleries. And Judith would say, the handbags are our children and they don't talk back. So you kind of get a feeling for, how they each felt. Gus was very poetic and Judith was very matter of fact.
Another question we have is, how many bags does your collection hold? Do you know about approximately?
Yes, so we have about 1,700 of Judith Leiber's designs.
Wow.
She designed over 3,500. So, one of the goals of the museum is to collect one of every one of her designs.
Wow.
So we're about halfway there. But there was never because most of her work was pre-computer, where now every single thing that's created or every action or every thought anyone has is documented on a computer. It was pre-computers. And so there's no sort of catalog raisonné. There's no, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, but it's actually one of my favorite things about my job is that I'm constantly looking. People are always emailing me, I have this bag, or, I want to donate bags to the museum because, my mother adored this bag and I want to honor her. It's really an amazing thing to meet people that have Judith Leiber bags and have loved them. And they all have great stories.
That is really, really wonderful. Somebody just made an interesting comment that they said the museum in East Hampton is a jewel. Yeah, and she's, the whoever said that, who is this? This is Klaus, is really complimenting you guys over there. She said it's worth the trip and it is wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy you came and that you loved it. We are very proud of it. And someone's asking if the Leibers had nieces and nephews that can carry on the tradition. But interestingly, they do. And Gus had 5 siblings and was very close to, his nieces and nephews and great nieces and nephews. I mean, the great nieces and nephews have they were very much inspired by the Leibers and are very artistic and creative, and even, in music or art, or, really incredible people. And, but none of them are handbag designers. And one of the reasons that the Leibers ultimately sold the business is it was becoming harder and harder to find those craftspeople. Okay. And that, they always said that, people didn't want to, sort of have their hands in the glue. They wanted to be doctors and lawyers and, so the nieces and nephews were still very close with them, and the great nieces and nephews. But really the Leibers, their legacy is going to continue through their museum and through talks like this, which I'm grateful we're doing, and to really, be able to keep their legacy alive through the museum. The business is owned now by a big branding company. It's called Authentic Brands Group. And they own a lot of different brands like, Juicy Couture. They own Prince Tennis. I mean, they own a lot of different brands. They also own Elvis Presley's estate. They own Marilyn Monroe's estate. But they are the owners now, and the designers who are designing, there are 2. The company is called Judith Leiber Couture, and Jana Matheson, who I spoke about earlier, is one of the designers. She's the chief creative officer, and then the other is Dee Hilfiger. So Dee Hilfiger is Tommy's wife, and she is a handbag designer, and she loved Judith Leiber and Judith Leiber's designs. And so she came on more recently than Jana, maybe like maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And she is one of the designers of Judith Leiber couture handbags.
Wow, that is interesting.
Yeah.
Nancy, someone is asking if the recording will be posted. Is it going to be, where can someone else access it?
It will be on our YouTube. If you go to Jewish Museum Florida-FIU, the YouTube channel, it'll be posted, I would say, within a few hours.
Cool. Excellent. Excellent. All right. So that brings us to time, unfortunately. And it was such a pleasure having you on, and really, really a pleasure. And like I said, I'm glad we can continue on with this exhibition in some fashion. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, I really enjoyed being here. Thanks for having me.
And
I love the show at your museum. It's just stunning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. If anyone wants to see the virtual tour of the show, we put it up on our website, which is jmof.fiu.edu. And, you can see the exhibition at any time, or you can visit Anne directly in East Hampton. Where are you located? You are...
So we're in East Hampton in the hamlet of Springs, very close to Amagansett. And it's where the Leibers bought property in 1954. And then in 2005, built the museum on part of their property. So it's a really gorgeous property and museum. We're close to the beach, so if you want to make a weekend of it and come out, there's beautiful places to stay, and some really incredible artists. We've got Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner's house, about 3 miles away. Jacqueline or Larson's property, the famous textile designer, is about 5 miles away. So you could come and make it a whole art and beach week or weekend. So come.
That is lovely. That is lovely. And what's happening upcoming at the Leiber Collection?
So we're working on a 100-year celebration. Judith and Gerson Leiber would have both been 100 years old this year. And so we are celebrating their life and legacy. And then also in the sculpture garden, I'm working on an outdoor sculpture exhibition. We have a permanent collection, which is friends and neighbors of the Leibers from their generation. And then we always, to keep their the spirit of their love of art and giving to young artists, I curate an exhibition for the sculpture garden. So that one will be really exciting as well. So you can spend time outside, and then we have, timed tickets to enter the museum to keep everyone safe during this crazy COVID time. So
wonderful. Thank you so much again, Anne. I really appreciate it. And thank you guys for joining us today for Thursdays at 3.
Jacqueline, I can't see me, but I just want to add that Susan Gladstone, our executive director, was on, and she wanted to thank Anne and thank you for a wonderful day. And of course, thank Meryl and Danny Weiss again for sponsoring Thursdays at 3. So thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.